Okay, I hope everything's working. Yep, been recording for 7 seconds. Okay, today we start a new topic. This is Phil 385-585, week 7. And today we are talking about game theory. So first, I apologize. We're back in the realms of charts, numbers, and utility functions. There's nothing much I can do about this. Game theory is built on this, so it's part and parcel. Hopefully everything in the topic 1 made sense, because if it didn't, this is going to be a little tricky. Now, I'd craftily intended Sandy to be the bad guy on this one, and reintroduce all of these charts and maths and so forth, but it was not to be, so made my bed, I'll have to sleep in it. And here we go. Now, first up, what is game theory? It extends from instrumental rationality. We take the instrumentally rational agent and we put them in interactive situations where the outcome of their actions does not solely depend on their own decision-making process, but the decision-making process of others as well. This may sound odd, but think of any game like chess. I can't just make a certain set of moves and win guaranteed in a game of chess. It also depends on my opponent. Their moves partially dictate my decisions. And this is the very essence of game theory. So think of it like a game where the outcome is codependent. It is not singularly dependent on the actions of one agent or another. If it is dependent on the actions of one agent or another, it is not game theory, it is decision theory. Okay, so, given that, we need to have a quick look at instrumental agents just to brush up again. So, what is an instrumentally rational agent? Well, they are rational, they are self-interested, and they are maximizing. Now, this all sounds rather cold, but this is essentially what the self-interested rational agent boils down to. Self-interested, rational, maximizing. They are the rational part encompasses perfect calculation, knowledge of their environment and the situation they find themselves in. Self-interested simply means they have their own utility function, which they will stick to vehemently, and it is coherent and organized. And maximizing simply means that in any situation they will attempt to pick the one that offers them the maximal benefit of, or the maximal benefit of their utility function. And this can then be, when we compile this with expected utility, we can then work out values of utility function. If it's only 50% likely, I will satisfy a member on my utility function which I only prefer 40% more than the one below. I may choose the one below simply because it is 100%. Now, we may not agree that people are actually like this, but this is the most productive description of the rational agent in this regard. This agent works best with game theory. Other agents are not nearly as fruitful in terms of what we can identify with game theory. What sort of decisions would come to, what sort of dilemmas, what sort of information can we glean. The instrumentally rational agent provides us with the most material to work with. Now, as I said, agents have a utility function which seeks to maximize, and it is important to remember that it is only their utility function, their own utility function, which they wish to maximize, not those of others. If they have a desire to maximize the utility of someone else, then that appears on their own utility function. Even this selfless desire is their own self-interested node on the utility function. All right. Now this is important to keep in mind. I'm not going to go over it too much, but you may find a dilemma in there. It's not covered in the unit notes. It's not really part of the unit, but have a think about it. It's one of my personal pet peeves. This how can self-interest encompass selfless? But anyway, now. It does not always result in the best possible outcome. Game theory is not necessarily like this because of these rational agents. They are in a competitive environment necessarily. So the best possible outcome for everyone concerned is not necessarily the one which rational agents will arrive at. It is not a case of seeing, well, I can see all possible outcomes and I can see the best possible outcome for all individuals, therefore I will go with the decision that I have to make in order to come to that outcome. In fact, it may be that if I know that I will come to this decision and somebody else knows that I will come to this decision, I can get stiffed on it. And this is what Robert Frank actually calls the desire to not be the chump. So we might not want to be the person who acts altruistically only to get abused for it, or only to have our confidence in the human race abused. So anyway, we'll come to this as well. Now, there are some questions this week you might want to keep in mind. Next week I'll introduce the first half of the questions and Sandy can introduce the second half. I'm only providing half of next week's lecture, so you won't have to listen to me drone on for very much longer. I'm actually quite excited. This is my topic. Game theory and this sort of thing is my topic of choice, which I have studied for years. And so this I feel most comfortable with, and instrumentalism as well. Kantianism I still feel comfortable with, but not necessarily to the same degree. Now, the questions for this week. What does it mean the prediction of human behavior has a conditional nature? Keep that in mind. It will come up and be answered in this lecture. What are the prerequisite assumptions of game theory? Again, answered in this lecture. What is the interdependency problem, not independency, interdependency problem? That one should almost be self-explanatory given what I've already said. What does it mean that the choices of two agents are in equilibrium? This is a bit harder to grasp, but I will go over it. It's not explicitly pointed out in the lecture slides. It is in the lecture notes, but I will give as best description as I can of it, because I feel that trying to walk you through it is not nearly as easy as showing you by giving you the slides and the real choices. Why does the equilibrium of choices constitute a necessary condition for these choices to be rational? Now, this is a point that will be brought up, and you may question it. It's fine to question it. In fact, all of these are fine to question. What is the rationale behind the common knowledge assumption? Now, the common knowledge assumption will come into play as well. It will be described, and you will understand the rationale behind it, but at the same time you can also question it, because understanding why a thing is needed and how it works is one of the ways that you can actually then question if you actually need it and does it actually work. I'm working in my favorite part of philosophy straight up into this topic, in that questioning, and that is, as you probably have learned by now, questioning the established norm of the way things are done. So, first up, which isn't the first question, what are the assumptions? Well, first and foremost, we need to know that it's even possible to predict human behavior. We need to assume that there is a way to predict human behavior in order to even start the whole project of game theory, and that is predicting human behavior in interactive situations. Now, we feel humans have free will, which makes them able to defy any predictions we make of their actions. How then are we to make predictions? And this is a problem we came to in the very first few lectures, and again in the second lectures, although I think Kant deals with free will better than the instrumentalism, or the instrumentalists do. So if humans are truly free, they are free to act against prediction, which is an interesting thing to comprehend. How can we make predictions when, as soon as we are aware of these predictions, we may violate them? Acting against fate, as it were. And this is a very real problem. Now, we may want to say, sure, you can, but it's not rational. If the prediction is the most rational thing to do, you can act against it, but you are acting irrationally. So predictions may be conditional on rationality. Instrumental rationality is the foundation of game theory for just this reason. We use this instrumental agent, we make predictions with this instrumental agent because they are maximally rational and utility maximizers. So this is the condition that we need to assume to get game theory functioning in the way that we want to use it in order to predict outcomes or the actions of people in interactive situations. Now, remember that instrumentalism goes into great lengths to factor in uncertainty in terms of expected utility and so forth. But this is uncertainty of outcomes, not of the actions themselves. Now, the outcomes uncertainty is part and parcel with the actions selected to achieve those outcomes. But in game theory, that uncertainty of outcomes is also partly determined by another factor that we can actually work out, and that is the decisions of other people. So the uncertainty in regular instrumentalism is not quite the same uncertainty in game theory, so just be aware of that. We factor in the uncertainty of outcomes in game theory, or we can, but we must also factor in the actions of others, and what we're trying to do is limit the amount of uncertainty in any game, so to speak. Now, there's an old quote, and I forget who it's from, but uncertainty about uncertainty does not lead to more certainty, but actually multiplies our uncertainty. Even if we're uncertain about how much we're uncertain, it doesn't make us more predictable, it actually makes us even less. I'm sorry, that one just came back to me, and I forget who said it. It wasn't even part of the script. But interactive and uncertain actions are very different. We have to keep this in mind. Now, the unit notes uses an example of Anne playing chess. And I'm going to use chess because I'm familiar with chess, I quite like chess. I'm terrible at chess. I'm not a rational chess player. Now, Anne is at a point in chess. It's also in the unit notes, so I'm not saying that I wasn't influenced in any way, but chess is a really good example. Anne is at a point where if she moves one pawn correctly, she will win the game. Every other move results in a draw. Can we predict what action Anne would take? This is a game. They have reached a point in the game where Anne can make one move and guarantee her win, and every other move will result in a draw. She has many options in front of her, but we tend to think that if she wants to win, and if she is observant enough to see the move, then she will move the pawn to win. Is Anne still free? I would say yes. So here, the conditional nature of this rational choice is Anne wants to win rather than draw. She prefers winning to drawing. And she is rational enough to see the move she can make that will result in this. And rational enough to see that all other moves are suboptimal in this particular instance. This is one of the explanations about how we can both be free and predictable. And the prediction is conditional. If Anne did not want to win, she preferred a draw to a win, then absolutely another move is rational for her. If drawing rather than winning is higher on her preference than winning is to drawing, if drawing is higher on her preference than winning, or tie, or whatever, then absolutely any other move is more rational than the actual move to move the pawn. But if we know that, then we also know that any other move other than the pawn will be rational for Anne. She is predictable as long as we know her desires, and if we believe, and if Anne actually is rational and observant enough to actually realize what's going on. She understands the rules of the game, and she can understand each move's ramifications. Now, this is a huge onus of rational capacity we give to Anne. Deep Blue, a machine that can think several moves deep, brute force wise, can still be beaten, which is one of the wonderful moves, which is one of the wonderful aspects of chess. We can program computers to think so many moves ahead, and these computers can still be beaten because of the interactive nature of chess. Now, it's conditional victory. Notice we make the assumption about Anne in order to say what she would do. Those assumptions are, she wants to win, she's self-interested, and that she can recognize the move that will achieve this. She's rational. This is a conditional prediction in just this way. It will only be accurate if Anne fulfills these criteria. If she does not fulfill these criteria, she does not want to win, or she is not rational, we can't predict. All of those other moves end in a draw, so they're all equivalent on the utility function. And I'm guessing there's going to be more than one other move. If all prediction, now I ask you, is all prediction thus conditional on such qualities, or are these chosen on a case-by-case basis? Can we simply say that if they are self-interested and rational, that is enough to make predictions, provided we also know the utility function and so forth? Something to think about. Are these the core conditions necessary? Or do we need to know extended information about the situation itself? Well, we may need to assume that all agents know all aspects of the game in order to make these predictions. But let's break Anne down first. What does it mean to want to win a game of chess? Anne prefers winning to losing, that's all. Anne will try to make this happen to the best of her abilities, if she prefers winning to losing. What does it mean that Anne needs to be able to understand the moves she needs to make? She needs to understand the game, she needs to be rational about her choices, and she needs to be rational about her opponent's choices. She needs to know all the relevant details of the game, and she can calculate what will happen soon after each of her possible moves. This is part and parcel with understanding what other people will do as well. If it's just simply this one move results in a checkmate, then she doesn't need to know her opponent. But if it is this one move opens up the possibility or forces my opponent to do another move that can only result in a checkmate, then she is still playing an interactive game, but she is assessing the rationality of her opponent. So what are the features of an agent? An agent has a system of preferences that is consistent and complete. The preferences are there. It is not just a simple matter of I prefer winning chess to drawing in chess, and I prefer drawing in chess to losing in chess. And also has other preferences, like I prefer doing other things with my time than playing chess, but if I must play chess, I would prefer to win. If she prefers other things with her time rather than playing chess, and this one pawn move may result in a long, drawn-out game, she may prefer to take a draw, simply because she has another higher preference. So it is not simply a case of these preferences, although we will just talk about these preferences for the time being. But the preferences is consistent and complete. It is not the case that Anne prefers winning to draw and draw to losing, and that next turn those preferences might change. They must be consistent in order to make this prediction. And they are complete. Everything can be ordered within that system, just like instrumentalism. All of my desires can be put into my utility function, and I can order them completely. Theoretically, I may not have actually done this, but they are of a kind that can be completely ordered in this way. They are comparable. They are equivocal, and I can compare them. An agent will act in such a way to bring about the most preferable outcome. Now we can proviso this with the most, or we can preface this, sorry, with the most likely eventuation of the best outcome possible. So we may want to weigh it in the expected utility sense. We must also hold that an agent has complete knowledge of the situation they find themselves in. If an agent doesn't fully understand the rules of chess, we can't fully predict their actions, because they may act in ways that they think are coherent, but we would not, because we understand the full rules of chess. Many of you may not know a very specific rule in chess, that if your pawn is moved out first 2 moves ahead, because you know you can move your pawn 2 moves in the first move, and somebody else has a pawn next to it, and they move it forward by 1 space, you can actually move your pawn diagonally to where their pawn was and take it. I'm not doing a good job of explaining this. It is one of those really sort of arbitrary rules. If they move their first pawn 2 spaces so that it lines up across from another pawn, that pawn can then take it as if it had only moved 1. It's an intercept move, and it only works if your opponent is moving that first pawn 2 spaces out. You can take it as if it moved only 1 and move your pawn to the space it would have been if it only moved 1. You are intercepting their pawn. They're simply moving with the home field advantage. Don't believe me? Look it up. I'm not sure what the move is called, but it is one of those rare moves that not many people actually know about, even people that are quite good at chess. One of the more well-known ones is the can't castle out of check, and you can't castle after your king is moved. So, but a lot more people know that than the pawn rule. So we know that we have to assume that an agent will act in such a way to bring about the most preferable outcome, and they have complete knowledge of the situation they find themselves in. They know all the rules of chess. They don't necessarily need to know all the strategies of chess, but they know all the rules of chess. And we have to assume that an agent's calculative capacity is at least sufficient to comprehend their choices and the possible outcomes of those choices. If they're making moves at random, we can't predict that. They are outside the realm of our cognitive, calculative capacities. And the assuming of predictability. If these assumptions are correct, then we can predict to a degree. If our agents satisfy these conditions, then we can reasonably predict what they will do. We can assert that if person P in situation S will act in a way to maximize their preferences, and there will only be one such maximal action A, then we can assume, or we can predict, that in S, P will A. Real life is never so simple. Real people very rarely satisfy these very stringent conditions on them. Rationality being the one most often toted about, because the calculation and the cognitive capacities needed, we can't even do in computers at the moment. And if our brains do it, they do it subconsciously on a level we are just not aware of. So rationality is one of the most suspect assumptions that we have of the human individual. And I'm inclined to agree, rationality is very suspect. In the very rigid definition and the very exhaustive definition that instrumental rationality wants to point out, or wants to hold, So it may not be realistic. Our 4 core assumptions may be a bit too severe in real life. As we discussed in the first topic, the bounds of our reason may be more constrained than they are assumed to be. Bounded rationality, we had a look at that. We spent basically an entire lecture on just how the instrumentally rational agent may be pulled apart, some of the flaws, and how some people have proposed fixing it. Now, we may not be able to decide between our preferences. I think I also brought this up, that if I am faced with a choice between 2 identical boxes of Kellogg's cornflakes, I cannot make a rational choice. One of them is as good as another. Now that's rather arbitrary. Whichever is closest is naturally going to be the more accessible, the least time wasting, and it satisfies other preferences as well. So I just take the nearest one. Milk might be different. I might be looking at use-by dates. So external information may solve this in terms of deciding between our preferences, but sometimes we may not be able to decide between 2 preferences. We may like strawberry and chocolate ice cream almost equally, and when given the choice between the 2, we suddenly go, I don't know, can I have both? Which might not, be possible. Now, these are assumptional difficulties, potential failures with our assumptions only. And we've covered these at length in the lectures on instrumental rationality. And you may want to go back and look at that when assessing game theory as well. In particular, looking at the flaws the prisoner's dilemma brings out in the last few lectures that Sandy will take. Prisoner's dilemma is brilliant, and I've actually had to cut out several examples of prisoner's dilemma here because I'm looking at things in a more straightforward sense. But Prisoner's Dilemma is one of those things that can be toted out, and it is really interesting and fun to think about, and actually applicable in the real world, which gives more credibility to game theory, actually, even though it's meant to show some of the weaknesses. These are assumptional problems. I don't even know if assumptional is a word, but assumptional problems as potential failures with our assumptions. Now, assumptional problems are intractable. We cannot account for what we don't know. If these assumptions are wrong, it means we don't have the information necessary to make predictions. So, only if these assumptions can be held can we make such predictions for this formulation of game theory. There's nothing we can do about these assumptions if they're wrong. If we can come up with a better assumption that still lets us do what we want to do, great. Somebody do that, you'll win a Nobel Prize, I promise. Now, what about conceptual problems? What do we do when the situation is infinitely more complex than a simple move in chess? What do we do when outcomes are probable rather than certain? We already know what we might do in that. What do we do when actions of someone else's party determine the outcomes of our own actions? These are conceptual problems that we may be able to solve. So, what is a conceptual problem in this sense? We looked at conceptual formulations in Kant. These are actual puzzles within the framework itself, not assumptional difficulties, not foundational problems. These are problems that the actual process of applying decision theory to games and the real world throw up at us, but they are not assumptional. They are actually problems with the way we solve the problem. The mechanics of things. Risk has already been covered in the first topic, and if we just look at the previous slide, the second point there, what do we do when outcomes are probable rather than certain? Risk. Risk has already been covered. The unit nodes may seem like a step backwards in terms of complexity here. They go back over some of it in a much more simple way than we worked up to in the first issue. But I think it's unrealistic, and some of the unit notes are actually, I think, a bit too unrealistic and detract from the logic behind it, so I've had to come up with a few different examples. The second lot of unit notes, I think, and don't quote me on this, but I'm fairly certain the second lot of unit notes were written by Arkady Blinov and the first lot were written by Adrian, and I don't know how much collaboration they had in the writing of the whole and cohesive work. I think Adrian wrote the first two and Arkady took the first two and built on them. Or the second two was part of a lecture that Adrian built on in the first one. I don't know how this went, but I'm fairly sure there was a little bit of collaboration, but I think Arkady has gone back to first principles in an attempt to introduce game theory for its own merits, but I don't think this is entirely necessary. So there are times I'm going to deviate from the notes in this particular lecture, and I'll mention when I do. So it's okay if things don't line up with the notes as you're going through this. Just remember I've deviated slightly, but I think I've deviated for the purposes of clarity. So if you find the notes more clear, please post in the forums. I will redo the lecture at a later date. So bear with me. I felt a review of the situation was in order to keep it coherent with the previous lectures. So I have developed a new kind of game of chess that I've made up, melee chess. Okay? Because the unit notes at this point, and I just have to flip back, are a little vague on a few things. They talk about risk, but they move on. Sorry, let me just find the point here. They move on to that game of chess where winning might not necessarily, or is a very strange game of chess that results in then a dice roll for your winnings, and you may end up paying money. So winning may not be the most beneficial order. Might not be the most beneficial way to go about the game. So I've had to invent another situation which is a bit more believable. And this situation is melee chess. I think this game would be a bit of fun. Now, melee chess mechanically functions in the same way as regular chess, with one exception. Every time an attacker moves a piece to take another, they must roll a die and add the value to the attacking piece's value. If the total is greater than or equal to the defending piece's value, it is taken. Otherwise, the attacking piece is removed. So, piece values are pawn, 0, knight, bishop, 2, rook, 4, king, queen, 6. So even if you want to take a king with a pawn, you have to roll a 6 on a dice, otherwise the king wins. So that's a bit more of a competitive, a combative element to chess, because battles aren't just necessarily won on who makes the first move. Sure, it helps, hence you get a dice, but charging cannons isn't necessarily going to make you win. So, melee chess. Now, if Anne was playing melee chess, now Anne has a possible win condition, but since she is moving a pawn to take the king, she must roll a 6 on the dice in order to win. Now, this example you will see is on page 8 of the lecture notes 6. It is not melee chess here, it is just a dice roll for winnings. Let us also suppose that if she fails this roll, she will certainly lose the game. Simply because she is down her final pawn. Now, the pawn move gives an outcome with risk. Other moves still result in a draw, which means you don't have to roll dice. Nothing can take anything else, it's a draw. So there is no risk involved with the other choices. Let us assume that Anne prefers winning to a draw and a draw to losing. Would Anne risk it? Now, this greatly depends on Anne's preference weights. Is a draw preferable to a 1/6 chance of a win? And remember, this is expected utility again. Is a draw preferable to 5/6 chance of a loss? We have the tools to deal with this. We've already looked at expected utility. So the expected utility of the first action equals 1/6 U3 plus 5/6 U1. And the expected utility of every other action is simply U2. Now we just need to know which Anne would prefer. And we do this just by watching what she does and saying, okay, one of those, jumping the gun, one of those two utility functions will be the preferred utility function. And whichever it is, we know the preferences of Anne in that regard. Now, we can't work out a perfect preference, but we can say either EU1 is preferred or EU2 to N is preferred, judging by what N will do. Either of those actions will be rational, and we can work out the utility function from there. Now, the example in the books gives a complete cardinal layout of winnings and money, and we've already learned how cardinal values are not necessarily the greatest of values to use, but we can look at it in terms of the winning and the money you would get for such a winning. I think it's $100,000 versus paying $24,000 if you don't roll a 6 on the dice, which is ridiculous. And if that cardinal system was in place and the cardinal system was accepted, then sure, Anne wouldn't want to move the pawn because the risk is too great of actually paying money. The paying money would work out at being like, what I think it says here, negative 6,111 in terms of what you would have to give back, because it's 5/6. Anyway, so quick intermission. Up until this point, it's mainly been a recap of instrumentalism, in particular why we should hold to certain assumptions in order to facilitate the prediction, because these assumptions allow us to predict. We know what they want, we know that there is a utility thing, we know how they will act in regard to their utility function. I just said the utility thing, please ignore that, it's an intermission, doesn't matter. And most importantly, I invented what I think could be a fun game of chess. What do you think of it? I reckon we should give it a shot. Now, and the last one, should I quit my day job and focusing on patenting and marketing this particular game, melee chess? I think it's brilliant. I don't think I can market it very well. I think that would be irrational. I think the mere fact that I have told it means that anyone with a chessboard can play this game without it being marketed, because everyone also has a die lying around. That much is, they're like coat hangers. Every house has one somewhere. All right. What about the other players? We've looked at Anne's decision here in a game of chess, which assumes an interactive quality, but we haven't actually assumed an intelligent interactive quality yet. Chess is a two-player game, and we've been ignoring this point. Now, I love this quote by Jean-Paul Sartre. Hell is other people. It's very appropriate when looking at the complexity of game theory, because it is tricky to make decisions based on the actions of other people. When the outcomes of my own actions depend in part on the actions of another, I need to be able to reasonably predict what they will do in order to know what I should do. So I'm no longer just working out my own maximal action. I'm working out the maximal actions of someone else, and then working out what my maximal action is in regards to this new information. The real kicker is that they're doing the same thing. They're thinking, what would I do? And what is their maximal action given that? And then I have to think, given that information from them, what is my maximal action? All right? This may remind you of The Princess Bride when Vasily is going backwards and forwards in his game of death by drinking wine, one with poison in it and one without. One person puts the poison in, and the other person drinks. Long, waffly, you know that I know that you know that I know that you know that I know, and so on. And I'm sure everyone has had this experience in a game of rock, paper, scissors or some such. How many iterations do you want to second guess your opponent? Now, game of rock, paper, scissors, this is the decision diagram. These are the choices, the row and the column. Each get to make a choice. And we should all be intimately familiar with this game. We both throw rock, it's a draw. We both throw paper, it's a draw. We both throw scissors, it's a draw. If the row throws paper and the column throws rock, the row will win and the column will lose. If the row throws scissors and the column throws paper, the row will win, the column will lose, and so on and so forth. You can see how I've set this up. The first instance is what the outcome will be for the row, and the second instance is what the outcome will be for the column. Columns going down, rows going across, naturally. So, given this decision diagram, we can see that the outcomes of our decision are dependent on the decisions of someone else. Now, rock, paper, scissors is not guaranteed. Previous example, the outcome of my action is partly determined by my opponent. Therefore, my maximal action depends on the actions of my opponent. This is multi-dimensional decision making now. The previous example, there's no equilibrium point, which is why we use this game to settle petty disputes. There's no maximal strategy for either side to play. It is fair. Now, in the notes, it's referred to as the interdependency problem. This should ring bells in your head for what you were asked at the beginning of this lecture. My action is interdependent on the actions of somebody else. There's no maximal strategy here, so I cannot use information about the game and what is rational for my opponent to do to give me any information about what I should do. I start to think either iteratively or I guess, because there is no telling how many iterations my opponent will think and how many iterations I must then account for. So, I mean, if you can guess how many iterations or how deep into the stack your opponent will delve, then you know what your choice shall be. But I would suggest instead we use external heteronymous information about our opponents. If my opponent is a 6-year-old boy, I am going to put money on the fact that they will be more likely to choose rock than scissors or paper because of my personal information, my personal experience of being a 6-year-old boy, and I thought rock was strong and therefore beats most things, even paper, for some reason. So we might want to use this sort of information. How might we extrapolate this? Well, what kind of man is this? Do they have a small child that might be a 6-year-old boy? Would they be the type of person that lets the 6-year-old boy win, in which case they're probably more used to throwing scissors? If they are not the kind of person that would let their 6-year-old boy win, they might not throw scissors but throw paper more often in the expectation of winning most often. So we might want to throw scissors if we want to win against this person. Man or woman, parent of young boy throwing rock. And sure, these might be stereotypes, but this is just my experience growing up. Your mileage may vary, but we will use this sort of information we have at hand to help us make a decision in games without equilibrium points. But we want solutions. Games are no good if we can't make predictions, so we want solutions. So, in order to solve such problems, we need equilibrium points. In the previous example, both maximal options completely depended on the actions of another. Not all games are like this. In fact, very few are. If all games were like this, we would play any game to settle disputes because they would all be fair without equilibrium points. Now, consider the following game. Now, this game is slightly modified from the game on page 11. From the game on page 10. It is the same game, you will see, but I've put it in terms of win, lose, draw, rather than 0, -1, and +1, and this will become apparent later on. And also, I should bring up that on the unit notes in page 11, the second half of the page is referring to a hypothetical game, even though it looks like it is referring to the game in situation 4. And the examples they use when they're talking about the computer spitting out responses to strategy A1, it is not the rational strategy. When Accardi is talking about that, he is talking about a computer spitting out responses that has been that is programmed to work out maximal strategies, but they're not actually the maximal strategies. So be aware, if you read that second half of the paper in the unit notes and refer it to the game on the previous page, it is not referring to what is the actual strategy. Simply the fact that the computers need to be the same for both players, that they both have access to the same information, including the same predictions. Now we can consider the following game. There's a unique equilibrium point highlighted at A2, B2. Okay? This is a weird game. A very weird game. Why is this the equilibrium point? Well, if I am player A, and I look at what is the most maximal choice for opponent B, I can look and I can say, okay, cool. If the second option is B, they've got draw, lose, win for option 1. They've got win, draw, win for option 2. And they've got lose, lose, draw for option 3. Well, option 2 more often satisfies their utility function. So I'm pretty sure they're going to choose option 2. What would I do if they choose option 2? Well, if I choose option 1 or 3, I lose. So I better choose option 2 as well. What does player B do? They look at player A and go, cool, well, option 1 gives them draw, loss, win. Option 2 gives them win, draw, win. And option 3 gives them lose, lose, draw. Well, they're not going to choose option 3. And they're less inclined to choose option 1 when they've got a win, draw, win condition. So knowing that player 2 will pick option 2, I should pick option 2 as well. Not only that, it happens to be maximal for me. So this is an equilibrium point. This is what we can expect both players to fall upon. If they are both rational, understand the game, understand the decisions of each other, and can apply that information to their own decisions. Why? Now we can see the equilibrium point because we can see what is most beneficial choice for both players. And each player knows this as well. The game is not perfectly balanced like rock, paper, and scissors was. Therefore, an equilibrium point may exist. It doesn't necessarily exist, and there may be even multiple equilibrium points, but it is not balanced. And in this instance, there is one unique equilibrium point. We assume both players know the rules, they are instrumentally rational, and they are able to compute the problem in the same way. And they both have the utility function, win is greater than draw is greater than loss. Fairly reasonable assumptions, I would say. Now, both see that the other's best choice is 2, and thus that their best option is also 2. They also see that their best option, irrespective of their opponent, is 2. So this might not be as convincing. Here's a more complicated game. Now, I've switched it over to numbers, and I've invented this one myself, just to show you why this might be more complicated. Where is the equilibrium point? There's actually 2, and I've highlighted them. And you will notice one of them is bad for both people. slightly prisoner's dilemma-ish. The other one is sort of neutral for both people. Now, in no way can they both get a bonus. It is competitive in this respect. Why are there two equilibrium points? Well, let's do the same thing this time. B looks at A's options. Now, option 1, they've got -1, 1, and 1. That's a good option. That's a net gain of 1. Now you'll notice I've switched back to numbers to make this a bit more coherent. So let's just assume these numbers are fact. What about option 2? 0, 0, 1. Another net gain of 1. What about option 3? A net gain of -3. They're probably not going to pick that option. So their options 1 or 2 are equivalent for player 1. Alright, what about player 2? Player A looks at player B and says, what are their best options? Lo and behold, they're the same options because it's balanced, but it is not, it is equivalent, but it is not balanced. They see the same thing. For option 1, they have -1, 1, 1, net gain of 1. For option 2, they have nothing, nothing, 1, which is a net gain of 1. And for option 3, they have -1, -1, -1, so they probably definitely will not pick that. So, with this information, they know that the two options are equivalent. A looks at B and says, cool, they will pick either one of those two. What other information can you glean? Well, we both know A knows that B will never pick option 3, and B knows that A will never pick option 3, because that's ridiculous. Every outcome is a loss, so they will never pick that. Knowing that they will never pick that, we might not want to consider the outcome of that. So now we just look at these two and go, cool. Option 1 for A is -1, 1, which is 0. And option 2 for A is 0, 0, which is 0. Oh, it's equivalent again. Damn! Well, now it doesn't matter what they pick. But assuming that both players calculate in the same way, the same number of iterations, they will either end up both on option 1 or both on option 2. Because both players have the same options in front of them, and they both know that their opponent will act in an equivocal way. Now, unless one of them iterates further than the other, and we are assuming they are identical sort of players at this point, and we are taking out the utility function here, they will pick either both pick 1 or both pick 2, because they're mechanically identical and they reason in the same function. However, in reality, this probably won't happen. They will see that their decisions are equivalent, and they will most probably, well, not most probably, but with a high degree of certainty, we can say that they might not pick the same option. And option A1, B2 might be picked, and option A2, B1 might be picked. Tricky thinking. Previous example, there are two equilibrium points, 1 for both people and 2 for both people. Now the choice that is maximal for both players is 1, and knowing this, the best response is 2 for both players. And knowing this, both players should play 1, and so on and so forth and so on. It's infinitely regressive. Now this can only be resolved if we realize that the cardinal numbers are actually preferences, not numerical values. 1 plus -1 is not necessarily the same as 0 plus 0 for those options. So, let's make this trickier. Let's bring back our win-loss draw. So, win is greater than draw is greater than loss. The game is the same, you will notice, except now we have lose-lose, draw-win, draw-draw, win-draw, and so on, all the way throughout. The values are the same. Now things get tricky. Depending on how much someone prefers win to draw and draw to loss, the equilibrium point will become clear. If a player only slightly prefers win to draw and greatly prefers draw to loss, then option 2 is safest for them. If a player greatly prefers win to draw and only slightly prefers draw to loss, then option 1 is safer for them. Thus, the equilibrium point is dependent upon the player's utility function. This allows both players to have the same rational capacity and come to the same conclusions, but also differ in their utility functions and the weights they would put on each outcome. Bonus of using utility functions is that they make no assumptions about what the player will prefer. One player may even like losing above the other alternatives. In the above instance, it will not make a difference to the rational choice of the other player, but sometimes it might. If both players enjoy losing more than the alternative, then both players should be picking the third option, as this is a guaranteed loss for them. And both the equilibrium point will then be 3-3. Grid reference 3-3, A3, B3. That is the equilibrium point, and that is the only equilibrium point. Why not the first option? See how they both lose if they both pick 1 and they both pick 3? If they both prefer losing, then option 3 gives both players the best chance of losing. So that is the equilibrium point, and B1, A1 does not even factor in, even though they also lose, because it is not the best option to lose. If B1 picked, if player B picked option 1, then they are lose, draw, lose. And their opponent, if they picked A2 because they want to win, would undermine their chances. Knowing this, that player A may pick option 2, what would they do? They would pick option 3, because that then guarantees their chances of losing. Furthermore, it actually lets player A win. But player A doesn't really matter because both of those two options are winning for them. So only option 3-3 is an equilibrium point, even though it is an identical outcome to option 1-1, simply because of the rationality behind it. Now, the common knowledge here is needed. Both players need, and this should also ring a bell for those questions asked, both players need to know the same information and have access to each other's reasoning. This access does not need to be direct, but that they can actually accurately reason from each other's perspective to work out what the other will do. Now, this can lead to an infinite regress, like the one that was witnessed earlier when we're choosing between option 1-1 and option 2-2, and that however far each person considers the other to iterate will determine their best possible outcome. Now, remember again, this is the iteration. If I know that A2 will pick 0-0, if I know that B2 will pick 0-0, let me start again. If I'm a player A and I think B2 will pick option 2, I should pick option 1, because that will let me win and they'll still get nothing. B2 knows this as well, so they should pick, in this instance, they should probably stay at option 2, because they wouldn't want to move. But they don't consider this. They're still at the previous one where they're on 0-0, and they think A2, and they think that A2 will think that B1 will move to option 1, because that will limit their choices. Let me start again. Think of these as simultaneous decisions. A thinks B will pick B2, right? They do this and go, great. A thinks B will pick B2. If they do, my best option here is to pick A1. B thinks A will pick A2. Great. If they do this, my best option here is to pick option 1. If they do, they both go to -1, -1. Now, B now thinks A1 will go to option 1. A2 will be on option 2 and B2 will be on option 2. So they're both on option 0. But if you want to move to 1, and this one wants to move to 1, they'll both move to 1. And they will thus result in a -1, -1. B understands that A may want to move to 1 if they assume that they will pick B2. So then they move to 2, because that will upgrade their -1 to a 0. And A2 does the same, which leads them both back to B2. And this is why this is recursive in this way. Even though the values are different, and we know that if they both pick B2, it would be the best outcome for each. -1, -1 is still an equilibrium point because of the deliberative process involved. This may be a little hard to grapple with, but think about what you would do when you're considering the other person, because there is a reward offered on changing your decision. You both may change your decision and end up with even less. This is actually a prisoner's dilemma problem here, but this is two equilibrium points. Prisoner's dilemma only has one equilibrium point that is a tragedy, but we'll get to that later. There are multiple equilibrium points here. If these cardinal values accurately represent what both players would value each option, we are left with multiple equilibrium points. Now, they're no help in deciding which to pick, option 1 or 2. Even though we know one is bigger than the other, the two equilibrium points suggest that neither of those is essentially a rational choice, or they might both be rational. It's perfectly possible for one person to pick one and the other two, and thus eventuating in a rational choice for a non-equilibrium point. But it might not be rational. We may say that there is no rational choice, yet option 3 is clearly irrational. So we're differentiating here between no rational choice and clearly irrational choice. Option 3 is clearly irrational. It is not maximizing your decision or your utility function. So if there's no equilibrium points, we have a problem. Like in the original example of rock, paper, scissors, this game has no equilibrium points. And just like multiple equilibrium points, such games do not let us decide which choice would be the rational one in this instance. How do we decide if there's no equilibrium or if there are multiple equilibrium? It seems we can only decide games, it seems, there are arguments for deciding games with multiple equilibrium points, in terms of theories that have complicated names which I've forgotten, but basically using all sorts of abstract theories and maths that I can't even remember. But there are arguments for it. Anyway, how do we decide in these instances? Whatever we use, it seems that equilibrium points are not always enough by themselves to prove the answers we seek unless there is only one of them in a game. These games have solutions, other games do not. If we're using something else like heuristic notions and other information, like small boys may choose rock over scissors or paper in a game, these are external information into the game, not necessarily anything to do with preferences per se of winning or losing, but preferences of action, which may be a way to decide this, the more we know about them. But we're now stepping outside the realms of game theory itself. This may be something you can use to factor into game theory to perhaps solve these problems, but that's up to you, and I'm not going to cover that just yet. There are some things to consider. Situations with equilibrium points numbering more or less than a singular cannot be resolved with reason alone. And I say reason alone, we need external information in order to solve these, if they are indeed solvable at all. It is not a human limitation. This is a conceptual problem. This is not an assumptional problem. This is a conceptual problem of the framework of game theory itself. It stops us discovering the best course of action, but the situation itself that forbids it is not a human limitation. The logic runs out here. We can't solve these. So what's gone wrong? Is it reason that is limited? Is our notion of reason here the thing that's stopping us? Are there multiple reasonable options? And is it the equilibrium that is limited? Is it our notion of equilibrium that stops us making decisions? Some people are saying it is, and they've got other ideas for how we may calculate between multiple equilibrium points. Particularly in repeated games, which is another thing I'm not going to cover here, but you can look into it. Of particular interest, if you are interested in the topic, look up the tit-for-tat game, or tit-for-tat strategy in a honesty game. I think this might not be the... Oh, no, in the defecting idea. The tit-for-tat strategy is a way to get out of the prisoner's dilemma in a defection game. Anyway, it's interesting, but it's to do with repeat games, and this is one of those ideas that equilibrium points will eventuate over repeated games. So maybe it's equilibrium that's the problem. Is the whole thing just grossly oversimplified? Is this reduction of our decision process too simple to come up with proper solutions? Because we obviously come up with solutions in games with multiple equilibrium points. We may have a tough time nutting it out, but we eventually nut it out. There is no instance in which we just go, I cannot make a choice, because even not making a choice is a choice in this instance. In no way do we not act. Not acting is not existing, and we continue to exist. We only ever make the non-action once, and it's permanent. So, first of all, could the problem possibly rest completely with reason? If the problem is with reason and nothing else, then we may be forced to conclude that reason may not be the supreme dictator of our actions. The whole notion of homo economicus and instrumentalism may be undermined if we pick this course of action. If reason is the problem, if we don't reason in the way instrumentalism says, we have a very big problem. It makes instrumentalism completely useless outside of basic decision theory. And it may be even useless for that as well, because we've undermined reason itself. So this is a big call. We may not reason in this way. And we may save it with something like bounded rationality or so forth, that we have limiting reasoning capacities and we only calculate a certain level and so forth and so on. And maybe that will help us. Maybe bounded rationality can tell us how many iterations we will go down those rabbit holes in order to determine the equilibrium point. It might not be so terrible to do away with it, but it does undermine the foundations of a lot of research and a lot of things we have held true for a very long time. At least, I want to say, 60 years now. But that doesn't mean it's infallible, and it may be that reason is the problem. It'll just mean a hell of a lot of work for social scientists, in particular economists, to emerge from the rubble, because it would take down a lot of things. We could reject equilibrium. Now, this also has a problem. Economists would also have a problem with this, because these equilibrium points are what keep the market at a stable, self-regulating position. And without it, the market is not self-regulating, and you can't hold neoliberalism. But again, that's another point for another time, one that I will not cover here. So equilibrium may be at fault. It may not be a deciding factor in our rational choices. But how far can we go without it? What other measure will we use for rational decision-making in interactive environments? If we're not using equilibrium, what other points can we come to? We can simply choose what is the best option for our opponent in a vacuum without considering our options and make our decisions thusly. But of course, we would be incredibly ignorant to think that our opponent would not also have this in mind and base their decisions partly on our decisions. And then we should base our decision on their decision, and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on, and we just get infinitely recursive anyway. The only thing that gets us out of this loop is when we find equilibrium points, where both options coincide, and we realize that this is the rational decision to make, the best decision to make in this situation. So equilibrium points sound like a really good way of getting rationality to come up with decisions in interactive games where the outcomes partly depend on both parties. Now, the reason we like equilibrium is because it contains a reflective component that enables reassessment of a situation in light of the choices of others. Can we separate the notion of intelligent, reflective agents from the notion of equilibrium? That's possible, but we may need to further complicate the idea, which brings me to the third point. Do we need more complexity? Final option here is to increase complexity. Famous quote from Einstein that I will now ironically paraphrase: make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. Einstein's original quote is much more longer and complicated than this, but this is as simple as we can make it. I'm explaining my jokes, which makes them less funny, but so be it. Is this a case of a system being made too simple? Have we glazed over some very important decision-making qualities that we need to take account of in order to make sense, proper sense, and predictive sense of our decision-making? If we have, it's too simple, and all we need to do is, hopefully, all we need to do is re-enter the complexity that was lost in the oversimplification of the modeling of the rational agent. If we do that, hopefully the problem will solve itself. If it doesn't, we may need to make some other adjustments along the way. can we keep game theory, rational choice equilibrium, and all the advancements made with them and just add another layer to solve the problem? Most prefer this latter option. Most social scientists, because this is an obvious problem with game theory, multiple equilibrium points, lack of equilibrium points, and so forth. Now, most people opt for putting an additional layer on the problem and attempt to solve the problem. Mixed strategies, bounded rationalities, risk-averse, risk-taking. Did I spell averse right? I'm not sure. Anyway, risk-taking behavior, heuristic deciding mechanisms, multiple utility functions, even ethics has been used to try and make these decisions. These additional layers have been tried and put on and so forth. But this is, in essence, in an attempt to save an existing system, which might not be worth saving. This is something philosophers can do, but maybe the economist can't, because they need to preserve their current model, because otherwise they make themselves completely redundant. So personally, as a philosopher, I'm not convinced by any of them, and I think the problem is actually fundamental to the project itself. Now, our model of the human agent is too simple by far, and in ways that would not allow for game theory to easily adapt. Be aware, my opinion is worthless. Don't be persuaded by me because I am voicing my opinion on this matter, and because I'm giving you a lecture on it, you probably assume that I am an authority on this. And to a certain extent, I am a kind of authority on it, but not in the way that I would go bragging about. I'm deeply confused by all of this. I've studied it at length, and a lot of it is problematic, confusing, and melts my brain. And I try to understand it the best I can, but I am not claiming that I understand it perfectly. I am competent at this sort of thing. I am not a master of game theory. I'm not going to claim to be. So don't take my opinions as gospel. I've not provided you with the reasons why I hold my beliefs, and I'm not going to. I expect you to form your own beliefs with your own reasons on these particular topics. What do you think of game theory? Another friend of mine is also deeply disturbed by game theory, and they have their own reasons. I disagree with their reasons. I think they're a bit too strong. But what do you think, and why do you think it? This is the ultimate question in that lecturers and unit coordinators need to ask their students. What do you think, and why do you think it? The why do you think it is the most important part. I haven't given you why I think mine. I don't want anybody to take that and pollute their perspective with it. I want to know why you think your position is the right one. And let me tell you, I'm in the minority in my views. I am not in the majority. I don't agree with the majority of the work out there being done on this particular topic. But then my whole career doesn't depend on the usefulness of Homo economicus like many careers do. As I mentioned, it is catastrophic if this doesn't work for an economist. In a different way that a revolutionary scientific theory that overhauls previous ones, a paradigm shift in a scientific department, would not threaten the careers of scientists, because science is based on the revolutionizing of ideas and getting new and new and new. Economics is not tied up like science is. Economics would not survive, as we know it, economics would not survive a reshuffle of Homo economicus. Neoclassical economics certainly wouldn't. It would be completely demolished, and there would be nothing left to rebuild on, because it is the sole foundation of the economics discipline. So maybe they're a bit more invested in that than, say, a scientist is in the conservation of energy, the laws of thermodynamics, and so forth. So take all this into consideration, but come to your own conclusions. Now, every philosopher has their subject that they argue vehemently, and this one in particular is mine. It takes all my mental resolve not to pollute your own reasoning with mine, and I may have done it slightly earlier, but that was not my intention. I just want to bring your attention to possible avenues of inquiry you might want to stick your nose into and ask questions in regard to game theory and reasoning in general. I simply state my opinion as a way of asserting that it is acceptable to challenge the established norm on these matters, no matter how scientifically they dress themselves up. In fact, if they were particularly scientific, they would welcome challenge, because that is what science does. It challenges itself. It is not challenging anything else. Any scientist that tells you it is there, or anyone who purports to use the scientific method to challenge God, is full of it. That is not what science does. It does not challenge the existence of God. It challenges the existence of what it already knows, over and over and over again, until it is more sure of what it knows, or it is sure that what it knows is rubbish, and it does that. All right. So it is not science if we cannot challenge these assumptions. However, just challenging them and tearing them down is not productive. You have to provide better assumptions and a better solution. So it's one thing to just tear it down wholesale and say, great, it doesn't work because these assumptions are ridiculous. Milton Friedman is famous for holding up ridiculous assumptions, and he's been attacked on it at length, to the point where his theories on ridiculous assumptions giving correct answers has been dubbed the F-twist. Now, Milton Friedman is a famous economist and so forth, but his idea that we can hold ridiculous assumptions so long as we get the correct conclusions, we don't care. And there's actually something to that. Don't just dismiss that because it's ridiculous, and it may sound ridiculous, but if it gives the best solutions, and we have nothing else, then absolutely we use that method, even if we know it's completely bunk. You want to pull it down completely, you think of a better representation that works better in its predictive power. We will always use the best system we currently have to answer the questions we currently have. I don't have a better answer than game theory. I'm just very suspect on it. And that doesn't mean it should be dismissed wholesale. Its contributions cannot be or should not be understated simply because its assumptions are suspect. Until someone comes up with a better system that produces more reliable predictions, we will probably continue to use it. So keep that in mind. Now, next week, you're going to have that chance as we cover the methodology and applications of game theory. That chance, what am I talking about? Establishing the norms. We're looking at von Neumann and the emergence, von Neumann and Morgenstern and their famous book that produced game theory in the first place. And then after that, you'll hear names like John Nash, which, you know, A Beautiful Mind and so forth, who came up with all sorts of, what was his particular idea? He came up with another type of fixed point equilibrium, and I can't remember the actual name of it. But I will by next lecture because I'll look it up. But yeah, John Nash built on von Neumann and Morgenstern's thesis of game theory in the first place to come up with his famous theory, which was then made into a movie, A Beautiful Mind, with Russell Crowe and so forth. You can go check that out. Anyway, that's it for today. So I did run over a lot of material at a breakneck pace, and I'm sorry. This is one of those areas that I do feel particularly comfortable in, so it's going to be fast and furious because I don't have anybody to look at to slow me down. When I'm talking, I understand myself fairly well, and I can't see if other people are confused, so I didn't slow down. So I'm sorry if you have to go back and listen to this a second time because I have run through quickly. I hope that isn't the case, and I hope if you do have to go through and listen to it again, you do get it on the second time, and that I haven't made things too confusing. Okay. Wow, that was quick. Sorry about that. Okay, next week, methodology. I will only give half of a lecture. Sandy will give the other half of the lecture, of next week's lecture in the unit notes. And then after that, it's over to Sandy completely. I hope you've had fun in these lectures. I've actually had a bit of fun in this one, that's for sure. And I hope you're finding the topic interesting. Game theory in particular can be a lot of fun to play with. Maybe it is a bit insidious to take it too seriously. Too seriously. Take it seriously, but maybe taking it too seriously can be a bit dangerous. Have a think about it. I'll try and bring up some of those dangers next week. Anyway, for now, I hope I get this one up in time. It was a bit of a rush job. I've got more marking to get back to. Have a good week.